This is the second part of the Function E module. In this video we're continuing to look at domain and range as we were in part 1, and we're looking at the square root function in particular. Okay, you need to know what different functions look like, so we're starting to be looking at that now. Now when determining the domain of a function, as already mentioned, you need to look at what x values you can have. Now with a square root, you can't square root a negative number, so we need to look at when the square root of a negative number will occur, so we know that that can't exist in the domain. Now the expression under the root symbol should be set at a value greater than or equal to 0 for this exact reason. Okay, so your domain is restricted basically because you can't have a negative square root. Now the graph of the function will assist in determining the range. In TM+ we're really looking at just the graphs. In TM2 you'll learn other ways of finding the range. So let's start by looking at our first function, which is f of x equals the square root of x minus 2. Now because we can't square root a negative number, we can say that x minus 2 has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so if I add 2 to both sides to get x on its own, I have that x is greater than or equal to 2. Okay, always be careful when you're doing these with your inequalities. If you ever divide by a negative, you have to remember to change the direction of your inequality, just like you learn in inequalities and absolute values. Okay, so my domain is x is greater than or equal to 2. Now the range, you really need to look at the graph, and your x-intercept for a graph is when y equals 0. So you've got 0 equals the square root of x minus 2. Square both sides, 0 is x minus 2. Take 2 to the other side, so add 2 to both sides, 2 equals x. So that's giving us our x-intercept of 2, 0. Now as you'll learn further on in this module, a square root function looks like this. Okay, so it curves up. The starting point is at 2, 0. So we'll learn more about that later. I know that sounds silly, why don't we learn it now? You really need to learn it in a certain sequence so it makes sense. So when we're looking at that, you can see here that that's our domain. X is greater than or equal to 2, as we already determined. In terms of our range, it only exists from 0 up. Okay, so our range is that f of x has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay, so I know you're wondering, how do I do this if I can't draw a graph? We'll be looking at graphs in I think in the next section, so it'll become clearer. Now let's look at this one. Again, it's a square root function. F of x equals 3 minus the square root of 2x plus 1. Again, this here, the square root, is what's determining our domain, because you know that 2x plus 1 has to always be greater than or equal to 0. Take 1 from both sides, 2x is greater than or equal to negative 1. Divide both sides by 2, x is greater than or equal to negative a half. Okay, so that value there is also giving you your x-intercept. You've noticed from the previous example here, domain is x is greater than or equal to 2, and also the x-intercept is 2, 0. That will always occur with these square root functions. So when I come to the graph, I have a negative in front, so I know I'm looking at an upside down absolute value function, or a reflected function. I know it's going to start at x is negative a half, so let's say that's there, but I need to know what y value that is. So if I substitute in x is negative a half into my function, I should work that out. So I want to work out what f of negative a half is. That's going to be 3 minus the square root of 2 times negative a half plus 1. 3 minus the square root of 2 times negative a half is negative 1. Negative 1 plus 1 is 0. So your answer is 3. So negative a half, 3. So that means I'm only doing a sketch, it doesn't have to be perfect. So that's the point, -1/2, 3. Because of that negative, I'm not going up like this, I'm going to go down. Okay, I could work out what my x-intercept is. I don't really need it, but if I wanted to work out what that x-intercept is, it's just when f of x equals 0. And you can work it out, but it doesn't help me answer the question. So when I'm looking at my domain, I can have all these values here. So the domain is x is greater than equal to -1/2. For my range, in this case, my y values only exist from 3 down. Now, it's f of x, so f of x is less than or equal to 3. Okay. Now these videos again are split into different sections, but there is only one exercise. So what you need to do now is move on to the next video, which is part 3, where we look at what we call hyperbolas. So we're going to look at asymptotes.